Hi, welcome to the digital version of my talk, Stop and Think, teaching players about media manipulation in Headliner. My name is Jakub Kasztalski, and I'm the founder and creative director behind Headliner and Headliner Novi News, which will be the case study for this talk. So jumping into it, what are games? Games at the core are about interaction. I think that's their most unique feature. While books can tell you something, movies can show you something, and poems can make you feel something, games are the only art form that can make you do something. However, when we talk about games and game design, we usually focus on things like engagement, fun, staying in the zone, staying in a state of flow. At the core, most games have a simple goal: keep players playing. However, here at Unbound Creations, we have a slightly different goal. We want our players to stop and introspect and really think about what the game is telling them and what their experiences can teach them. Of course, there's a lot of other games that achieve that very well. Spec Ops: The Line is a great example that makes players come to terms with the atrocities of war. Gone Home is also a bit of a narrative puzzle that just gives you enough information to get a glimpse of the story, but ultimately leaves it up to you to piece everything together. The Walking Dead is one of my favorite examples. It's one of those few games where I would literally spend 5 minutes staring at my controller, unable to make a decision because I was conflicted by the choices given. But I wanted to give you another example that's made me appreciate the value of games interactivity. Some of you might have heard of a little game called Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It's a first-person role-playing immersive sim, kind of like Deus Ex or Thief, but you're a vampire in Los Angeles, and you sneak around at night, you do quests and side quests, you uncover, a grand scheme, conspiracy, and you bite people along the way. When I started playing it, the game asks you what kind of a vampire clan you want to be, and I unwittingly chose a Malkavian without realizing that in the mythos of Vampire the Masquerade, that clan is basically insane. I didn't realize that the game was actually rewritten and custom designed for that vampire type, with all the dialogue being slightly different, with random things happening like little whispers or a stop sign would talk at you. There was one point where I was at my virtual home watching television, which kind of gives you a recap of the recent events, some of it based on your actions in the game. And at one point, the anchor just looked straight at me and told me that the police is looking for a suspect, and they know it was me. And I just kind of looked around, and I realized, oh my God, I'm insane. That was a very powerful realization for me that could only come from a game, because all this time I thought I was excusing in my head, rationalizing all those weird things happening, and without realizing that I basically have a mental illness in this game, and all those things that I thought were normal actually were not. It was a very shocking epiphany, and taught me that games have a great power to make players come to organic realizations. So with that, let me talk about our game, Headliner, and its sequel, Headliner Novi News. In Headliner, you play as a news editor. Every day, you get a stack of articles, you decide which ones get published, which don't, and then you walk through the city, you see how the city changes, you learn about the characters and how their life is impacted by the media, and you also see how it affects your own life and your own family. Someone described it once as the most realistic simulation of American mainstream media I've ever seen, which is very flattering and kind of what we're going for. So now you know how the game plays, but what is the game about? What was our goal? We wanted to make a game that makes players understand how and why media is manipulated and question their own biases. And more importantly, we wanted to do it organically. We didn't want to tell the player what they should think. We wanted the player to come to their own conclusions and kind of steer them into the right direction. And spoiler, this answer is much more complicated than just evil journalists trying to manipulate us for clicks. And I think it's a topic that's very relevant today, where sometimes just by switching which channel you're watching, it feels like we're living in two parallel opposite universes. And I strongly believe that if history is written by the victors, then the present is written by the media. And at the core, the game is also a bit of a moral and ethical dilemma, asking you, what are you willing to do to get what you want? Because you can always get what you want, but it always comes at a price. At this point, I want to give you a little bit of an example of how I feel we were able to deliver on that premise, on that goal of making players stop and introspect. I was watching a Canadian streamer playing the game, and I think about half an hour into the game, there was one of his coworkers was having some health issues, so she ended up in a hospital, and she was complaining about the system, and that made the streamer reflect on her own experiences with nationalized healthcare in Canada, and that made people in the audience also pitch in with their experiences from different countries, from Europe and the US, and basically the game was paused for a good 10 minutes as the streamer chatted with the audience, and the audience chatted back, and just sharing experiences and just introspecting about the pros and cons of various healthcare policies and decisions and their impressions, which is exactly what we hope to evoke with this game. We wanted to make players to stop and think, and I think that was a very good moment that illustrates that. Besides that, we've also had some world impact, likely. Our game has actually been used to teach a class on media literacy at the Pacific Buddhist Academy in Hawaii, and we've also talked to several other institutions about using it as a teaching tool. We got a mention in GeekWire, LA Times, Philip DeFranco Show, which is a big news YouTuber, kind of breaking the barrier of just being mentioned in gaming press. We also recently got a feature in the Scottish Sun. This game also been a case study for several other talks I've given at IGDA events, Foundry 10, Seattle Indies, and Seattle EdTech events. It currently has a 95% positive user reviews on Steam. It's won a Silver Award at Serious Play Conference, Best Indie Game of Tokyo Game Show. We've been to Indicate, we've been to Mini Mega Booth, and a few other events. We actually also made the game more affordable in countries that have struggled really badly with misinformation and on social media and the news cycle, such as the Philippines. So we just bumped the price down as low as we could to make it really accessible. Pretty soon, the game will also be featured at the Australian Centre for Moving Images and their exhibit about journalism. And I'm mentioning that not just to brag about it, but also to bring the fact that it's an example of how a game can reach non-gaming press, non-gaming audience, and it can really be something more than just pure entertainment. It can really go out there in the world and make other people reflect and question their own beliefs. So how do we achieve that? You kind of know our goal now. You know the premise of the game, but this talk is about creating those kind of experiences. So let's jump into the development process. We basically had 8 pillars and constraints that I will now go through in order to give you an idea of why we did them and how we implemented them and what the desired outcome was and whether or not we achieved it. So jumping straight in the first one, the picking important and relevant issues. I think it's important to focus on things that are relevant to people's lives, not only to draw them in, but also to send messages that are relevant to today's life. So how I did it is basically a lot of data mining. There's been a lot of talk about using Facebook and Google to mine data, and that's basically what I did. And I didn't have to spend a dime or do anything that's illegal. I just used the ad planning tools to kind of put different issues, to put in information for my target demographic and various criteria like, hey, people who are interested in video games and maybe activism, and then cross-reference that with different issues like LGBTQ rights or homelessness or immigration issues or healthcare, and kind of gauge what the reach would be of those kind of ads to get a rough estimate of how many people interested in those social issues are, also using a lot of different synonyms or different qualifiers. And of course, it's not 100% scientific. It's not something I would base a study on, but it's a useful data point to go off of. And it was also interesting to see different trends locally versus nationally versus globally. For example, in Seattle, there was a big push for homelessness, but globally on US as a whole, it wasn't as much of an issue. And there were also different trends between Europe versus the US. At the time, it was also a big Syrian refugee crisis was a big talking point in Europe, which was not as big of an issue in the US, for example. So it was definitely a very eye-opening experience, even if it was ultimately just a data point. On top of that, I've also conducted some in-person interviews, and that was me literally going to a coffee shop and going to random people and asking them, hey, can I take a few minutes of your time to ask you a few questions? And again, those are very local, so they're not broadly applicable, but they were a bit more in depth, allowing to ask some follow-ups and get a bit more reasoning behind those choices. After putting all that together and also taking these ideas that I know I myself wanted to focus on, I kind of pulled them into 4 main themes or categories that would be running out for the game. And due to the divisive nature of a lot of narrative and media these days, it was pretty easy to divide them into two sides of the same coin. So for instance, globalization and nationalism could be divided into closed versus open borders, war versus diplomacy, healthcare could be public versus private, regulation versus free market. And that led itself really well to representing those issues in-game through news articles. It was also important to make all those issues and all those stories believable. So that involved looking at a lot of existing news channels, anywhere from CNN to MSNBC to, yes, even Fox News, kind of to pick up on what issues are being talked about, how are they being talked about, how are the headlines structured, what is the first paragraph like, since all the in-game articles are deliberately a little short. So we kind of wanted to mimic that first eye-grabbing summary that most articles have. So to give you an example, there's one of the recurring themes is immigration, and there's a lot of worries about, immigrants coming in and being a threat to this society. And a lot of those ideas and rhetoric is based on the things that we've seen in press. And again, it was an issue that's both important in the US with the caravan crisis and things like that, as well as Europe with aforementioned Syrian refugee crisis. Another example is of minority discrimination, especially in the first game. And some of the topics raised were whether that certain minority group should have marriage rights, which is kind of mimicking what was been going on in the US with LGBTQ and gay rights. So that's an example of taking sort of real world issues and retrofitting them into the game and maybe obfuscating them a little bit, which I will get to in a second. So moving on to the next point, which I think is also equally important, is that even though we're representing all of those familiar issues, I believe it's important to represent both sides fairly and accurately in a way that everyone can relate to, because ultimately the bigger point is teaching about the media and not the specific issues. If your game has a very clear agenda, it's say pro or against immigration, then people who do not agree with that will immediately be turned off. Those are the people who are in your target audience. Those are the people who you want to help question their own beliefs. We kind of wanted to lure players into following their own belief, their own biases, and seeing their far-reaching consequences. As I previously mentioned, that involved a lot of reading existing media and kind of getting an idea of what are the arguments for and against, how are they being talked about. I also looked at a lot of historical photographs from various protests, so a lot of slogans, a lot of catchy phrases we've kind of retrofitted into the game as well. I've also looked at more direct sources where people are actually discussing those issues, such as Reddit, Facebook groups, kind of looking for the comments and seeing how are actual people, not just news channels, but how are actual people talking about those issues amongst each other. What are they arguing for? What are they arguing against? And to give you an example of nationalized healthcare, is I would look for what are the arguments for this issue, what are the arguments against this issue, and not just what I thought the arguments were, but what the actual arguments are, because it's very easy to build kind of like a straw man idea of what the opposition is. But if you actually dig in, you actually see that there might be a lot of different concerns out there that you might have not considered. And it's also part of the reason why there's a lot of miscommunication between two sides. I would also look if there's maybe scientific journals or maybe stats that back up either one to give it a little bit more legitimacy and maybe also replicate the kind of reporting that's being done on statistics, which I will give you an example of later. And that overall helps it make it more believable and genuine. It allows us to show those effects more directly, which I think it's critical to not just talk about those issues, but have those be part of the gaming experience. So for example, with healthcare, if you push for it and it gets accepted and there's a national program, then your brother can now get therapy, and he starts talking about cognitive behavioral therapy terms. So if anybody ever has gone through that, they'll immediately find it relatable and immediately find it more believable and genuine. Conversely, your coworker is stuck, maybe waiting at a hospital, maybe they have a long wait time, maybe they can't get the treatment they want in time, which is probably the number one complaint I've heard about nationalized healthcare systems. So again, it's something that people on that side will find immediately relatable, and they'll be able to just roll with it and fall into the experience and kind of get that bigger message over time, rather than being pushed away because they feel the game is tugging at them. So again, to give you an example, I was watching another streamer, this one from Brazil, talking about the elections of Bolsonaro, and it was again talking about healthcare issues and the policies that the country was taking on. So the chat started chatting about being either pro or against. Some were supporters of the president, some were against them, and the game just provided that background for that discussion. And what was nice is that it was a very civil discussion where people weren't jumping to each other's throats, where people weren't being defensive because the game wasn't necessarily attacking them. And I think not having that agenda just created that ground where both sides felt they could equally relate to it and share their thoughts and feelings and experiences, rather than one side feeling that they have to be on the defensive or on the offensive. So moving on, I think it's also important to have a fictional setting rather than just copying the real world directly. And I think the fictional setting acts as a little bit of a buffer that lets people distance themselves a little bit, and also lets people fall into their own biases a little bit more easily, versus if it's an actual issue in real life, they're going to be much more guarded, and it's going to be harder for them to buy into the fantasy of pushing clickbait articles and pushing an agenda. To give you an example, the first game is set in a world where people are genetically modified to the point where the non-modified have become a marginalized minority. There's only like 10% of them. So there's this new narrative, kind of similar to the movie Gattaca, where people who are not genetically modified are seen as an inferior and being discriminated. It's just a broader allegory for any kind of a minority group rights. And I mentioned earlier some parallels to LGBTQ movement. So if we did use something like immigrant rights or LGBTQ, I think people would immediately come with strong feeling towards that. And I think having this kind of a buffer helps people to fall down the rabbit hole more easily. It just makes it easier for our game to encourage you to push clickbait articles, because we're not advertising, hey, we should demonize this group in real life that it's just some fictional group that you know. So yeah, just go ahead, demonize them. We need the clicks, we need the ratings. Just don't think about it. Just do it for the number, do it for the gram. Getting more and more extreme and ridiculous until hopefully they reach a point where they realize, hey, wait a minute, this is just like this real life issue, and I've been pushing all this horrible agenda that's basically inhuman. Oh crap, maybe this is what's happening in real world, and maybe now I have to rethink that. But even so, even though we have everything fictional and kind of buffered a little bit, we still had a lot of players who would say, oh, it's too soon, or oh, I don't want to think about those things when I play a game. And frankly, I don't know how to resolve that. I don't know if maybe doing more of a buffer would be effective, or maybe that would risk being too distant and players not being in that connection. Maybe it's an unsolvable problem and there will always be players who just want to turn their brain off when they play a game, which is totally fine. And I enjoy my Team Fortress 2 shooting people in the face as well. But it's something to be aware of, that you won't be able to convince everyone that plays the game. Moving on, now that we have our issues, we have no agenda, we have a nice buffered setting, we still have to show the effect of all those issues. We have to humanize them, and I like to do that through the characters in the narrative. I don't think it's effective if the game simply tells you moral lessons. It's better if a character in the game you care about tells you about them, and it's even more effective if it happens to them or to you directly. And I think one of my favorite examples is I was chatting with someone during an interview who was talking about having an article that was basically a sponsored piece that they were contemplating whether they wanted to publish or not. They didn't agree with it, but it would give them potentially a raise. So after contemplating for a few minutes, they decided, I am going to publish this because I need to feed my dog. And I think that's a perfect example of why having kind of a human, relatable things in the game helps you question your judgment a little bit more, because it introduces that element of that personal bias that I think is often overlooked a lot in reporting and journalism and online conversations, that we all come from different backgrounds, we all have different things we care about, and those influence our choices. No matter how objective we try to be, we always have people in our life who are affected by those issues, and that'll affect our judgment as well. So a good example is your brother, who is an aspiring comedian but also struggling with some mental issues and also struggling with imposter syndrome, and a lot of the policies you push for will affect him directly. We wanted the player to really care about the brother, and we try to make him be a part of your in-game life. He asks you about your job, he asks you about your dating life if you end up dating one of the other characters, he comes over to your place, he plays with your dog, he cooks you dinner. So we do a lot to kind of reinforce that connection between you and the brother, and there's a few times where he may open up to you about his issues and kind of have a very heart-to-heart conversation. One little trick I used early on is I've read in psychological studies that, for instance, if you do someone a small favor, that actually makes you feel more favorable towards that person because your mind is rationalizing that, hey, if I did something nice to them, this means I have to like them or they have to be a good person because I did them a favor. So one of the first things your brother asks you is, hey, can you run to the store and get me some antacid because my anxiety is acting up and my stomach is feeling funky? That kind of creates a little bit of a connection you have with the character. But what was also important is that the very next day when we meet the brother again, he actually pays you back. And a lot of players were actually very surprised that he paid you back, but in a pleasant way, because it reinforced the idea that, oh, my brother is not going to rip me off. He's reliable. I can give him money and he's going to give it back to me. So it immediately established a level of trust as well. Another example is also your coworker. She's also an immigrant, and how you push the news will affect her directly. If you push for a lot of xenophobia, then her work status may be affected because she's still on just a work visa. And she's also a character that is dateable, so it creates another conflict of interest that, hey, maybe you want to pursue a relationship with her, but you also have beliefs in your news that hurt her directly. So again, it creates that very real human conflict inside you that hopefully makes you realize that some policies may be hurtful to the people you care about. Another character is Rudy. He's your local shopkeeper and a single father just trying to provide for his little daughter. And unlike your coworker, he worries that all the foreign mega corporations are going to come in and going to destroy his little business. So he's, again, at odds with the other character and creating another layer of conflict. And your actions will also affect his store, which is also where you go to buy things for your house. So if you basically destroy his little business, then you can no longer buy the things you want for your house. So that's also a way that affects you directly as a player. Even your boss plays kind of a hardball and is very stern with you, has a few moments where he shows a little bit of a weakness or personal character. And as you keep playing, you eventually start to realize that he is such a hardball because it is genuinely a difficult business to be in, and at the end of the day, he just wants everybody to have a job. He wants everybody to get their checks paid. So if you badmouth one of the sponsors and they pull out, then suddenly everybody loses their yearly bonuses, and now it's on him because he can't provide for his team. And I think it's important to have a variety of characters so that wide variety of players can always find someone they can relate to. Your brother Justin is something that I think a lot of indie devs or even YouTube creators or influencers can relate to as someone who's always struggling with imposter syndrome and trying to be in the public eye. Then there's Edie, she's also an immigrant and she's also always struggling with some discrimination. Again, that's something that probably a lot of people can relate to. Rudy, the shopkeeper, he's a father figure, so that's something a lot of parents can probably find themselves in. So it gives a lot of people someone to connect with and someone who they can really care and root for the game. Moving on to the next point, having no good or bad outcomes, only trade-offs, is important for reinforcing the overall message I mentioned about not talking at the players, but helping players come to organic realizations through their own actions. And by that, I don't mean that it doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. It's just that there isn't like a win or lose condition. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about paying the price for what you want and always facing those trade-offs. So in the first game, that was actually very simple. We had three main objectives: your career, your family, or the society at large. Choose two. One of them you can do really well in, second will be kind of okay, and the third one will just burn to the ground. So it always forces you into considering the trade-offs. The new game Headliner Novi News, it's bigger and more complex, so there's a lot more room for nuance. So I went with a simple rule: for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, aka no good deed goes unpunished. So if one choice affects a character positively, it would affect another character negatively. And because we had three main issues and three main characters, it was easy to create a very simple kind of a cascading matrix of alternating effects where every character was intertwined with another one in opposite ways. It was just very simple and clean, but also lent itself well to creating a lot of friction in the player decision making. And that's what helps us create a scenario where the players would have to consider that, yes, you can get what you want, but how far are you willing to go to get it? What are you going to sacrifice in the process? Who are you going to throw under the bus? And what other unintended consequences your choice might have? However, there's a word of caution here that I've learned. Psychologically, we tend to perceive negative effects much more strongly than positive effects. So initially, when everything was really balanced, people still felt like they're lost. They got what they wanted, but because they felt the negative effects more strongly, they still felt like they were losing. We had to rebalance things and kind of ease things a little bit and exaggerate the positives, downplay the negatives, because I think there is a difference between feeling like you can't win or you always lose. And it's a very fine line that we tried not to cross. Moving on to the next point, and this is something that's now a little bit more specific to our game, but it may be something useful to consider as you design something similar or in this space. Replayability. The game is about the effect of media on society, so the best way to experience that is to see all the different ways the game could play out and all the different influences you could have as a news channel. So play it multiple times, see all the different endings, see all the different meanings. So how do we achieve that? First of all, the game is deliberately short. The first headliner was actually only 45 minutes long for a single playthrough, which is also, by the way, a perfect length for like a class. There's a lot of multiple parallel branchings. Each character has actually 3 to 5 different endings, and they're not all necessarily mutually exclusive. So you can kind of get a mix of different endings. We also introduce new content on subsequent playthrough and have a little bit of fourth wall breaking, similar to what the Doki Doki Literature Club or Nier Automata do. It was definitely big inspiration during development. For example, when you start a game, the whole intro sequence is different and it kind of alludes to the idea of parallel timelines. When you start playing the first day, all the character conversations are completely rewritten, they show a different side of the character, and they all allude to this former previous headliner that maybe has done some bad things. So it communicates to the player that, hey, the game knows that I'm replaying it, so I should expect something new. I should expect there to be new experiences. We also add a new character and make some minor gameplay changes and some different events to make that experience feel fresh. We also play on the insider knowledge, where now that the player kind of knows how roughly the story plays out, they can prepare better for certain bad events that might come. An example of this, at one point your brother may end up in prison, and I had a player who said that the day before that happened, they bought a big couch and a bunch of furniture for their home, so they didn't have the bail money anymore, and they were just distraught that they couldn't get their brother out. But now that they're replaying it, they know this might happen, so they're going to be smart about saving up. Which leads us right to the next point, kill your NPCs. Because the game is meant to be replayed multiple times, then we can just kill an NPC halfway through the game. And it's okay if they're missing for the rest of the game, because the player is probably going to replay it. Now they can save it and uncover a whole new storyline maybe they missed the first time around. And last, it's a very unique feature we did, is called the Share Your Ending feature. As I mentioned, each character has several different endings, so when you beat the game, you get a little 5-sentence summary of all your major outcomes, and you have a chance to share that with the community, and before you start the game, you see the previous player's ending. So again, it encourages you to replay the game by seeing all the different potential outcomes there are, and we've actually done this through Twitter. So if you go to Twitter and search for the hashtag #IamHeadliner2, you're going to see all the different player endings and all the different combinations. We also kept the summaries a little bit vague so that they give you the sense of the possibilities without spoiling it away. Honestly, all of this was difficult. We probably rewrote the whole story maybe 3 times over, and it was a lot of testing, adjusting all throughout the process, a lot of rewriting, which is also part of the reason why I don't want to do voiceovers, because the dialogue kept changing constantly. A framework that kind of worked best for this is, instead of having a single branching narrative, what I did is I set up each character as sort of having their own independent storylines that were interconnected through various issues that I mentioned, and kind of that cascading matrix. And also maybe at some points they would interact with one another. For instance, your date may come to your brother's comedy event if you invite her, or Rudy may talk about your brother coming into your store drunk. But mostly they were just separate, tiny little small branching narratives, which was much more manageable than like a giant massive tree. And it also allowed us to create that effect of having different mix and match endings for the characters, which a lot of players that we've seen enjoyed kind of trying to game the system and trying to find sort of like the best combination of outcomes. And because it's not entirely deterministic either, and there's some wiggle room, there's also a few cases where you've got endings that I frankly didn't know was possible. For instance, in the first game, there's a case where basically the whole city gets torn to the ground, your daughter disappears in the riots, and then your wife says that she's content and happy with how things turned out. And I didn't even know that combination was possible. I thought it wasn't, but apparently somehow they did it, and they shared their ending with a comment saying like, yep, I married a sociopath. So it was a fun little element of kind of an emergent gameplay that wasn't even unintended, and again, this system lent itself well to giving that possibility of that happening. Now to share some fun stats. Over half of the players that beat the game at least once beat it again, 7% played it 5 times, 28% shared their ending, and 85% of players adopted Doggo. So moving on to the next pillar, teaching by doing. If we want the players to learn about media manipulation, we have to make them manipulate some media. So this is based on a number of techniques that I've either seen or read about being commonly used in media to kind of distort reality or push an agenda. One of the most basic examples that we are all probably familiar with is statistical manipulation. So using data to prove a point that maybe doesn't really prove that point if you under further scrutiny. So one mechanic we have in the game is where you get 2 articles, they are stapled together, and you have to choose one. The other will be rejected automatically. So this way the game basically forces you into picking a side. So at one point we used that to show how statistical manipulation works. We had 2 articles that both cite the same study with the same number, but they present it differently and draw a different conclusion. One uses a fraction, one uses a percentage, one talks about it as it being really low, the other talks about it being too big and too impactful. And I've seen at events where people would get to that point, they would just nod their head and be like, oh, I see what's going on there. And hopefully that makes them be a little bit more skeptical next time they see a number in paper, and maybe they'll think twice about checking on, hey, what's the sample size? Or what's the inverse of that percentage mean? Is it really as bad as it sounds? Maybe it's just framed this way. Another example is profiling. Every few days you'll get an article about a crime being committed, and it'll either describe it as being done by someone who's foreign looking or maybe someone who looks like a native. And depending on which articles you publish will shape the opinion of people. For example, if you only publish articles talking about crimes committed by the foreigners, then suddenly everybody on the street will think that it's only foreigners committing crimes. And we already see that so much, especially around racial lines in the US. And it's something that I really wanted to also showcase in the game. And it's a little bit more subtle, where it's not quite spelled out as much as in the previous issue, because we wanted the players, again, to organically notice that, hey, everyone is starting commenting about the media only talk about those kind of crimes being committed by these people. Oh crap, maybe it's because of the articles I've been publishing. But actually the number of articles for either side is equal. So it really depends on how you frame it and which ones you decide to publish. Another common technique is repetition, lies of omission. So your boss constantly pushes you to, stick to your same viewpoints, keep pushing it further, because merely being exposed to the same idea over and over and over, you start to believe it even subconsciously, even if you think you don't. So again, that's a very powerful technique in media where you just get steamrolled with certain information. Another example is scapegoating, which is something we see in media all the time. Whenever something bad or tragic happens, there's always this need to pin the blame on something. As the saying goes, there's nothing to fear but fear itself, and there's nothing scarier than the unknown. So we often jump to conclusions even when we don't have the full information. An example of that in real world is the Kavanaugh kids thing, which exploded overnight, and a lot of people kept flip-flopping on who are they blaming, and every day there was new information coming out. There was a lot of online rage that even now hasn't gone away. There's people who still haven't changed their minds, even though there's contradictory information that came out, because they made those initial impression, because there was such a need to, have a villain that people could just pin all their hate on. And that's something that happens in the game, where there's some bad events that happen, and you're pressured to, just choose someone as a culprit. Here's all the potential things we can blame, just choose something. We need to give people an answer. There's also a third option that's not spelled out, where you can actually not publish any of the articles and not blame anything, and the game actually acknowledges that, and your brother even makes comments that he's glad that for once we're taking the time to think rationally through this and gather information before we jump to conclusions. Another example is packaging, bundling, and hidden agendas where you're trying to push a story about something, but maybe embedded in there some kind of a hidden message that you haven't really noticed, but it can kind of get subconsciously lodged in your head. A real world example we're seeing right now is when talking about coronavirus. I've seen some reporters refer to it as the Chinese coronavirus, which is kind of a sneaky way of pinning the blame on China and spreading a little bit of a xenophobic rhetoric. Another thing that you'll see in the game is government and financial pressures. So whether it's government officials denouncing you as fake news or lauding you as the voice of the people, or maybe your company struggling with staying afloat, needing to sell out a little bit to get extra funding, it's something that's very real. And when I visited the Boston Globe at a journalism conference several months ago, financing was one of their biggest concerns because unfortunately, ads on online articles don't pay the bills anymore, which is why you're seeing a rise of things like BuzzFeed and clickbait articles, because you have to draw the viewers in somehow. And lastly, now that you have all your issues, you have them cleanly laid out in a fictional setting with no agendas, you have relatable characters, you have balanced trade-offs, you have replayability, teaching players system literacy, don't forget to put the game in your game. At the end of the day, it's still a game and has to be engaging and fun to the player. You want the players to stop and think, but you still want them to go back and keep playing afterwards. And I think that's something that's still a little bit missing from social impact or educational games, which focus a little bit too much on the teaching and not enough about enjoyment of the player. And I feel that's finally changing a little bit in the recent years, but it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to spread a message of awareness. So how do we achieve that in our game? Well, first of all, we start with an attractive art style and compelling story just to immediately draw player in, create a sense of mood, and kind of stand out a little bit from other indie games. A lot of the effects are accelerated and they're exaggerated because, again, it's a video game and not everybody wants to spend 50 hours. And because it's also a game, it's a little bit assumed that, hey, things are probably going to move a little bit unrealistic pace. And also, even though some people said the game moves too fast, personally, I like it as also another layer of commentary about the pace of media these days, how one day a tweet goes viral, the next day everyone is retweeting it, then the next day it's already in CNN and NBC and Fox News, and the pace of information and internet outrage is just unprecedented nowadays. So I do like how the game kind of mirrors that, even though it is even more extreme. We added little nuggets of joy in the games, things like you have your apartment, you can decorate it, or you can adopt a dog and you can feed it treats, you can play with it, and every day it gives you little nuggets of wisdom. And it's not something that even really has an effect on the gameplay, but it's a cool little something there that people can kind of feel relaxed in after all the stress and watching all those things unfold. There's a little bit of a breather room and something just nice to have and enjoy that's maybe not even relevant to the main game. So the last thing is adding a bit of unintended consequences. We didn't want the game to be entirely predictable and deterministic. Every now and then we want to throw the player a little bit of a curveball, a little bit of a plot twist, just to keep it more engaging, kind of keep them on their toes, and make it more fun also for replaying when, you know, there's maybe different things could happen. So that wraps up all of the pillars and our constraints. But before I finish this talk, let me talk about a few things that we tried that didn't quite work. Maybe it's a cautionary tale, or maybe it's something that you could try to make work in your game. So first of all, the spouse you hate. In the original Headliner, you go through the sequence of choosing news articles, you walk and watch the city change, and at the end of the day, you sit down with your family, your spouse and your daughter, and you have a dinner. You chat, you talk about the day and what's going on in their life. So with the original design, your spouse was basically kind of the devil's advocate. Whatever you published, she would always share opposite viewpoints. She would try to change your mind. But the effect was that a lot of players came out feeling like, yeah, my spouse is really mean. They're never supportive of anything I do. They're always disagreeing with me. And that was really clashing with the purpose of having that sequence and you caring about those characters when you always felt like they were attacking you. So in the end, we ended up rewriting the spouse so that she has a firmer stance. They have their own idea on issues that they always stick to, no matter what you choose. But also they are a bit more understanding and supportive. So they may disagree with you, but they're still going to be there for you and be like, well, I trust you. Another example of a thing that didn't quite work out is having little influence indicators. On some articles, we wanted to show how those articles would affect certain issues such as nationalism, healthcare, and show you how the public would react to it. The problem with that was that at the core, Headliner is a narrative experience. It's about a story, it's about the characters, it's about making the world feel real. It's not about numbers, it's not min-maxing resource management. So having those kind of indicators kind of gamified the game a little bit more than we wanted to, and ultimately we ended up removing that. However, it's something that we actually brought back in subsequent playthroughs, as I mentioned about adding content when you replay the game, because at that point the players sort of experienced the story, they've experienced the characters. So I thought it was kind of a nice treat to give them a little bit of a glimpse behind the scenes and maybe let them game the system a little bit at this point if they wanted to. And I still think that's maybe an interesting idea for a different kind of a game that is more numbers driven, and there's a whole different commentary you could make about, hey, the content of the articles doesn't matter as long as we get the numbers, which is sort of what we're seeing with a lot of mobile game ads nowadays that don't look like the actual games that they are leading to, but that's another whole topic. Moving on to randomization. Initially, we wanted the game to be much more procedural, a little bit like ADDs Around the World or Reigns, where the storyline is more dynamic, it's different every time. The problem with that is when you have random events happening, it's really hard to create a sense of a story arc. So when players played the early alpha, they felt like they just kind of jumped in the middle of things, random things would happen, and then the game would end. And there was no start, there was no real beginning, there was no real sense of progression, and it was harder for us to spread that message without having a clear story arc. So we ended up scrapping a lot of that randomization in favor of just traditional story. But we still left some elements of randomization, so maybe there's some events that may happen, may not happen on a much smaller scale that aren't plot critical, or maybe there's stuff that'll happen on 61 playthroughs that hasn't happened on the first playthrough now, again adding to the replay value. I still love that idea of creating something more procedural, but just something that we didn't have time or funding to keep iterating over, and it was just a safer bet to go back to linear storytelling for achieving our goal of teaching player about all this media manipulation stuff. And lastly, it's honestly been hard to keep up with reality at times. There's been a few cases where we would write a scenario or a plot line or an event, and then a few months later we would basically watch it play out in real life. And we were initially criticized when the game released that, oh, this game is too dark, it's unrealistic, this would never happen in real life. And then it happened in real life several months later, and we were like, well, this was not meant to be a guide. That was really weird. And ultimately, whenever you're trying to make a commentary about real-world events or make a satire, it may be difficult to do it properly when the world is getting crazier and crazier by the day, and some of the things you thought were extreme are no longer extreme. So in summary, I think games can be a powerful medium for sharing ideas and organically broadening horizons. Simple balanced trade-offs can force players into difficult moral decisions that maybe make them question their own beliefs. I think it's important to make players draw their own conclusions rather than talking at them, and let just players follow their own biases, let them do horrible things, and let them see the repercussions. Because video games, being interactive, are the only medium that can make someone go, oh my god, what have I done? Myself, what have my actions caused? And I think that's a very powerful feeling to make you stop and introspect. And that's something that only games can truly achieve. And I think this model can be applied to so many more issues that are relevant today. Amazon warehouse working conditions, we've actually made a short little game about that called Fulfillment. Look it up on Steam. We could talk about deforestation, pollution, environmentalism. We could talk about automation effects on jobs in the coming years, healthcare costs, anti-government protests, riots, trade wars, the ongoing pandemic, online privacy, propagation of misinformation on social networks, which is something that I'm sort of prototyping right now, addictiveness of games, addictiveness of social media, online harassment, trolling, doxing. There's so many topics that I think we can help people get a better understanding of and maybe be less toxic and less aggressive towards one another in online discussion if we can help them organically see the other side and get a bigger picture. And that about wraps up all my talk. I hope the points were useful. I hope you feel a little bit inspired. And normally I would ask if you have any questions, but since this is a digital version, then just feel free to tweet at me either at Unbound Creation, which is our studio, or directly at me at Kubazor. All the information is here right now, and let's connect. If you just want to bounce ideas, or maybe you're working on something like this, or maybe you have some commentary about how we could have done something better, just ping me. Let's chat. Next time we're at an event, let's meet up. Again, thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you got something out of it. Bye.